Hello. I have an email here from Mina. Mina says, I know you're not a diabetes professional, but I think you could have some thoughts around the combination of type 1 diabetes and anorexia. Anorexia when having type 1 diabetes. Personally, I have type 1 diabetes and I have also had anorexia for several years, but I'm really in recovery now. I don't have diabulimia, just pure anorexia. So I'd like to hear what you think about anorexia recovery while having type 1 diabetes. In order to stay alive, I have to measure my blood sugars, count all the carbs, put insulin in, and be very aware of what I'm eating. I can't just eat without thinking because I have to pay attention to it. And I know that being able to recover, you have to eat what and whenever you want and not think or analyze food or exercise, etc., and relax and all that stuff. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and opinions as it's possible to fully recover. Mina, this is a difficult question for me to answer in a general, because I haven't had experience with type 1 diabetes, and it's a difficult answer for me to put in a general YouTube just because most of the people watching this YouTube won't have type 1 diabetes. In the same way that when I was talking about the disability thing, it's a smaller percentage of the population is going to have type 1 diabetes and anorexia. However, I do want to say that yes, you can achieve full recovery whilst having type 1 diabetes and also having anorexia. And I think that for all of us, what full recovery is being back to where you were in terms of your attitude towards food, the way that you eat, the levels of emotion that you have towards food, the way that you were before you had an eating disorder. And so you still have that reference. If you were actually old enough to remember the way that you were before your eating disorder, you'll have that reference. And if you weren't, then you will probably, even if you were a child, you can imagine that the way that you would have been without an eating disorder. And maybe even as a child, you had to have somebody else helping with blood sugar measurements, and I don't know when you would have had the diabetes diagnosis. But all of those things would have still been in place before you had an eating disorder, I'm imagining. And so really, the answer is what you've got to work out in your head is, how can I get back to really it being the case that I'm only thinking and measuring and counting in the way that I would have done to manage my diabetes when I didn't have an eating disorder? Because that thinking and counting and measuring that you have to do with the carbs and things like that, that has a deeper meaning now for you, I'm sure, because your eating disorder jumps all over it. And maybe you do a little bit more of it than you really need to manage your diabetes. Maybe it has just more emotion attached to it now than it was before you had an eating disorder. And so what you've got to tap into is, how do you separate the two? And how do you really do the least amount of carb counting needed in order to just keep yourself safe and keep yourself monitored for your diabetes? I think that there's, for the purpose of recovery, while you're in the process of trying to get your brain to understand that it can relax around making food decisions and things like that, I wonder if you can give a little bit of that control over to someone else, a loved one, a family member, friend, partner, to maybe do some monitoring for you so you don't actually have to be looking at stuff. I don't know how possible that is, but I do think that you have to kind of make your brain pay as little attention to that stuff as possible and try and be as free as possible. And I think that you're probably a really smart person, and you know a lot about your diabetes and you know a lot about your anorexia. And so you're going to have to work out how is it for the recovery process, how is the way that you're going to manage this? How are you going to make it so that you can teach your brain as much as possible to not have that emotional reaction to food, that it's not as important as it thinks it is, and that it's not as you don't have to track, analyze, and be kind of anxious about it, whilst also keeping yourself safe enough for diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and keeping track of all of those things. So it's a really good question. As I said, it's a minority of people that have diabetes as well as anorexia, type 1 diabetes. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of people that actually will have that question. And I have been asked that question before, and I've worked with people with diabetes. And so that's the reason, actually, I know that full recovery is possible. And you, if you can, I think the best thing that you can do is find a doctor that really understands restrictive eating disorders and has a health at every size mindset, and also understands diabetes. And I know that that's a big ask, but that is like, if you can find a doctor or even someone with lived experience, so somebody else that has fully recovered from anorexia and also did so while having type 1 diabetes, I think that will be massively helpful to you. And I did a podcast, I think I've done a couple of podcasts on type 1 diabetes and anorexia, so there might be something in there. That's how, like, I don't even remember half the stuff podcasts that I do, and it's like, that's crazy, isn't it, that I can't even remember what I've said in a podcast, but that's just the truth, and that's my brain for you. It's like a sieve. So I hope that helps a bit. One thing I do also want to tap onto this is that if you are listening to this YouTube video and you do not have type 1 diabetes, do not be selective about what you just heard. That's all. I was talking to somebody who has anorexia and type 1 diabetes. If you do not have type 1 diabetes, I wasn't talking to you. Anyway, just saying that because I know what eating disorder brains are like. And eating disorder brains can be like, she just said that it's okay for me to track my food while I'm in recovery and to track my carbs. No, I was talking to somebody with type 1 diabetes. Okay. The thing is, for all of us in recovery, we have to do what the very best that we can do in our individual circumstances are. If a person has type 1 diabetes, their individual circumstances may mean that they have to track a little bit more of what they eat than a person who doesn't have type 1 diabetes has to track. So, if you do not have type 1 diabetes, it is not an excuse to say, well, somebody with diabetes can fully recover while tracking carbs, so maybe I should do it as well. Because that is not you doing your very best, and that is not relevant to your circumstance. Hope that makes sense.